Is there like latent fear in interacting with her that they say something wrong, like call her Meghan Markle instead of...
The decision arrived without ceremony, warning, or room for negotiation. Behind the heavy oak doors of Windsor Castle, Prince William placed his signature firmly beneath an official order that ended the Sussex's final connection to the British crown. 2 remaining royal patronages were revoked in a single stroke. For Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, this was far more than an administrative loss or a routine bureaucratic adjustment. It was a definitive moment the future king declared that their old royal life was truly and permanently over. William read to the final page twice before touching the pen to paper, the heavy silence in the room feeling much heavier than the formal document itself. A royal patronage, representing an official bond through which a senior family member supports a charitable organization in the monarch's name, carried profound public trust and institutional authority. The Royal Commonwealth Youth Fellowship and the Crown Veterans Outreach Trust had somehow survived years of geographical distance, explosive interviews, and rising tensions because King Charles quietly believed they might preserve one narrow bridge back to active service. Now, that fragile bridge was being deliberately cut by the very man expected to inherit the throne. The Prince of Wales paused for a brief moment, took a deep breath, and signed both removal orders with an unwavering hand. His expression did not soften even as the dark ink settled on the paper. He had spent the preceding months compiling a meticulous private record of disputed instructions, broken commitments, and rare occasions when royal connections had been utilized without proper palace approval. A documented internal review ultimately showed that this decisive action was not merely revenge for one television interview or a list of public accusations. Rather, it was a final answer to an ongoing pattern that he firmly believed had weakened the integrity of the crown's word. Across the estate, King Charles received a duplicate copy in his private study and slowly lowered himself into an armchair, placing the official paper beside him without speaking a single word. As a father, he deeply felt the agonizing wound of the separation. Yet as a sovereign, he fully understood the crushing pressure resting upon his eldest son's shoulders. Direct crown supervision meant the palace would now control both charities directly without any Sussex involvement, effectively protecting the vulnerable organizations from ongoing uncertainty, but also confirmed that all remaining hope had completely surrendered to institutional authority. Harry received the devastating news just minutes before the official palace statement was publicly released, keeping the phone pressed tightly against his ear long after the palace aide stopped speaking, acting as though one more sentence might somehow reverse everything. Across the room, Meghan read the digital announcement in total silence. The Duchess did not cry or raise her voice. Instead, she looked straight at him and calmly asked whether Charles had approved the move or if William had decided entirely on his own. The official statement carried no open insults, carefully praising past service, confirming immediate reassignment, and firmly closing every single opening for negotiation. Yet beneath that polished restraint lay a much deeper, unbridgeable threat. William firmly believed he had successfully protected the monarchy from further instability, while Harry was equally convinced that his older brother had crossed a personal line that could never be uncrossed. Behind those lost patronages stood 4 principal figures, carrying vastly different emotional wounds, each utterly convinced that the others had forced this historic moment into existence. Long before they became fiercely opposing figures in a global royal crisis, William and Harry were simply brothers shaped by the exact same corridors, the exact same expectations, and the exact same devastating loss of their mother. Yet this patronage order ruthlessly exposed how drastically different they remembered that shared past. One viewed the crown as a sacred duty, requiring absolute personal sacrifice, while the other saw it as a family that had callously withdrawn its love when it mattered most. Standing quietly between them were Catherine and Meghan, alongside a father trapped in the middle, entirely unable to repair what raw power had permanently hardened. William carried far more than mere anger into this monumental decision. As the Prince of Wales, he faced relentless public pressure to prove that royal responsibility could never be accepted strictly when it offered prestige and applause. Service performed in the name of the crown also meant fully accepting its strict limits, official instructions, and high public standards without exception. Without that absolute accountability, he firmly believed every future royal promise would become completely negotiable, turning the institution into a hollow shell. Catherine had heard the lingering doubt in his voice long before the official announcement was drafted, sitting with him privately as he admitted that removing his brother's final responsibilities felt brutally painful. The princess did not dismiss his emotional agony. Instead, she gently reminded him that postponing a necessary and inevitable decision could easily become another form of cruelty, especially when ongoing uncertainty severely damaged the charities, the family, and the ultimate authority he would one day inherit. Harry experienced the order through a completely different lens. As the Duke of Sussex, he had voluntarily surrendered his active working position, but had never emotionally surrendered his rightful place within the family unit. Those two specific patronages were living proof that one vital part of his former life still legitimately existed. After receiving the crushing news, he walked away from Meghan and stood entirely alone by the window, reading the palace statement again and again. A hot wave of anger burned fiercely beneath his deep humiliation, feeling as though the institution had publicly defined him before he ever had the chance to truly define himself. Meghan watched him struggle deeply, and her own resentment sharpened into focus, seeing the removal as much more than a simple professional rejection. To her, it was a calculated attempt to control their global influence and completely erase the legitimacy they had carried through years of dedicated charitable service. When he remained silent, she warned him that passive restraint would never stop the palace from writing the final, unchallenged version of their story. King Charles desperately feared that exact finality, knowing all too well that reversing William's order would critically weaken the future monarch and instantly reopen every single dispute the document was designed to settle. Yet, allowing it to stand unchanged might permanently estrange his youngest son from a family forever. After reading the confidential document through, he telephoned his eldest son and asked quietly if he truly understood the immense cost of his actions, to which William firmly replied that he did, and that was precisely why he had waited so long to act. Catherine had previously tried everything in her power to prevent that heavy cost, with a documented account from her private office showing that she personally encouraged one final face-to-face conversation between the brothers before the order was officially signed. Harry ultimately declined the meeting after learning that palace legal advisors would be in attendance, seeing it not as a genuine personal reconciliation, but as a controlled and hostile hearing. William, conversely, viewed that refusal as definitive proof that his brother desired emotional recognition without any institutional accountability whatsoever. The fracture now reached far beyond two estranged men, touching every corner of the institution and threatening to leave scars that time might never heal. The final rupture did not begin with grand geopolitical statements or dramatic television broadcasts, but rather beneath the solemn, carefully orchestrated language of remembrance at St. George's Chapel, where every single movement had been meticulously planned and every word officially approved months in advance. Amidst the solemnity, Harry made a request that appeared completely minor to those standing outside the royal household, yet inside the inner sanctum of the palace, it struck directly at the heart of an existing, fragile agreement. What followed immediately after was not a sudden public explosion in front of the cameras, but tense, quiet conversation in a cold stone passageway, punctuated by one specific sentence that William would later describe as the exact moment everything changed forever. Harry had originally been allowed to retain two ceremonial patronages under a strictly confidential understanding brokered by senior palace officials. A royal patronage, by definition, is an official institutional relationship that permits a senior member of the family to support a charitable cause directly in the monarch's name. The written agreement at the time was crystal clear and non-negotiable. Neither role could ever be attached to commercial work, political messaging, or public appearances that had not been thoroughly vetted and approved well in advance. For the Sussexes, those strict limits felt increasingly restrictive and suffocating. But for William's operational team, they were the absolute foundational reason the arrangement could survive public scrutiny under intense media pressure. That fragile pressure finally fractured during the Commonwealth Remembrance Service, a solemn ceremony honoring shared military sacrifice across nations historically linked to the crown. Before the service even began, the Duke requested permission to deliver an unscheduled, independent address in his capacity as patron of the Crown Veterans Outreach Trust, firmly believing that his words belonged directly to the veterans rather than the palace administration. The request moved rapidly through private communication channels until the future king himself stepped out into the stone passageway to meet his brother completely alone. William kept his voice remarkably calm, explaining methodically that the speech had never been officially cleared and therefore could not be delivered under an official royal banner. Harry stared at him in disbelief, then slowly closed a leather folder containing his remarks, telling his brother with quiet intensity that military veterans should never need palace permission to hear from someone who had served side by side with them in combat. The answer came without a single second of hesitation. This was not about honoring military service, William countered, but about speaking the crown's name while simultaneously and publicly rejecting the crown's ultimate authority. Harry's face hardened instantly, and he bit out that if that was the case, the title itself meant absolutely nothing anymore. The ceremony proceeded as scheduled, but the confidential agreement had already cracked beyond repair. Afterward, unauthorized extracts from prohibited speech quickly found their way into an international media interview, where the Duke was still publicly identified through his royal patronage. A documented review conducted by William's private office recorded the broadcast as a direct, undeniable breach of the confidential terms. Meghan had strongly urged her husband not to surrender the message, believing that the palace was deliberately making the remaining roles impossible to perform in hopes the couple would eventually abandon them, without forcing an official, messy removal. Later that evening, Catherine found William alone in his study, still holding the crumpled service program in his hand. The princess listened closely as he stated firmly that the dispute was no longer about personal affection, damaged reputation, or past apologies. It was fundamentally about whether royal authority meant anything at all once its core rules could be ignored at will. She saw clearly that his initial sadness had transformed into absolute, unshakable resolve. King Charles, however, still pleaded for caution and restraint, proposing a temporary suspension in the hope that passing time might prevent another permanent fracture. William flatly refused, arguing that another compromise would only delay the inevitable crisis and make the eventual decision appear weak to the public. Reacting swiftly before that decision could harden into policy, Harry demanded an urgent direct meeting with his brother through a recorded call to the palace. Still convinced he could force the order back, the remembrance ceremony had created the immediate justification. But the outcome was not yet entirely irreversible until both men stepped into a private room at Windsor and discovered that neither of them had come to compromise. There were no cameras, no protective advisors, and no prepared statements waiting for them. When the brothers finally faced each other inside Windsor Castle, a single wooden table separated them physically, but years of accumulated accusations occupied the space between every single sentence. Harry arrived believing the removal order could still be withdrawn through persuasion, while William entered knowing with absolute certainty that he would not withdraw it under any circumstance. By the time one chair scraped violently and loudly against the polished floor, the meeting had officially ceased to be a negotiation. It had transformed into a complete and unvarnished reckoning. William dismissed the anxious aides waiting outside in the corridor and closed the heavy door with his own hands, taking his place at the table without speaking a word, while Harry remained standing and forcefully placed the revocation papers right between them. A royal patronage, meaning official permission to support an organization in the sovereign's name, was never inherited personal property to be managed at whim. To the future king, that distinction was critical because public trust entirely depended upon the exact same rules applying equally in private as they did in public. Harry struck first, accusing his brother of weaponizing powers he had not yet fully earned, claiming the order was nothing more than personal punishment disguised as modern institutional reform. William did not raise his voice or show anger, replying calmly that no individual could possibly keep representing the crown while actively refusing the mandatory conditions attached to that representation. That precise answer landed with devastating weight, because it sounded entirely final. Harry pushed his chair backward and finally sat down, the violent scrape against the floor breaking the last remaining layer of emotional control in the room. He demanded to know whether their mother, Diana, would have ever accepted one son, erasing the other from royal life entirely. William's face tightened visibly at the mention. Their mother's cherished memory still carried more emotional force than any constitutional order, but he steadfastly refused to let grief dictate a matter of supreme constitutional governance. Changing direction entirely, Harry proposed a written compromise prepared beforehand, offering to voluntarily surrender the Commonwealth youth role if he could be allowed to retain the veteran's patronage for life. He argued passionately that his military service belonged to him in a way palace politics never could, believing one single exception could preserve his personal dignity without threatening the stability of the monarchy. William had fully anticipated the offer, having already reviewed the exact same possibility with King Charles, who had rejected it for one undeniable reason. A permanent patronage operating entirely outside the working royal structure would inevitably create a rival center of authority, allowing someone completely beyond palace control to continue speaking with official royal weight. Leaning forward intensely, Harry challenged him directly, saying that William did not want accountability at all, but rather total obedience. William held a steady gaze without blinking and replied that he wanted the crown's word to mean the exact same thing in private as it did in public. The heavy silence that followed that exchange ended everything. Harry lifted the unsigned compromise paper, folded it once with sharp precision, and left it resting on the table instead of taking it away with him. He walked out of the room without offering his hand in parting. William remained standing alone long after the door clicked shut, his initial anger draining slowly into profound grief. Yet he still summoned his private secretary and ordered the publication process to proceed without delay. The personal appeal had completely failed. But a much deeper truth was only beginning to emerge from the shadows. William had not acted through stubborn determination alone. Standing firmly behind him was a carefully prepared, methodical transfer of responsibility from King Charles, proving that the machinery of the monarchy was already smoothly moving into the future king's hands. The final chapter of this profound institutional separation did not unfold behind closed doors or within the silent corridors of Windsor Castle, but rather on the bright, unforgiving front pages of international newspapers that captured the global magnitude of the decision for millions to see. By sunrise, the revocation order was no longer just a private family wound. It had transformed instantly into a global judgment on duty, exile, power, and belonging. Major international broadcasters debated fiercely whether William had heroically protected the core integrity of the monarchy or unnecessarily punished his younger brother out of cold calculation. Staunch supporters of the Sussexes labeled the decision chilling and completely unnecessary, while steadfast defenders of the crown hailed it as a long overdue assertion of royal standards. Then, a single newspaper front page appeared across London, capturing the overwhelming conflict in 4 unforgettable words that neither side could possibly escape. The London Herald placed William's signature prominently across its morning edition beneath a bold headline reading simply, "The Final Royal Goodbye." Outside Victoria Station, busy commuters stopped dead in their tracks beside crowded newspaper stands, photographing the stark cover and arguing passionately over whether the historic decision represented disciplined leadership or calculated cruelty. A royal patronage, once defined merely as an official bond allowing someone to support a noble cause in the sovereign's name, had now become the absolute center of a fierce national argument about who still deserved to wield royal authority in the modern era. One prominent political commentator called the revocation the very first defining act of William's future reign, a framing that successfully shifted public attention away from what Harry had permanently lost and toward the kind of resolute monarch his older brother might one day become. Another opposing network took the exact opposite view, describing the Duke as a decorated military veteran stripped of his final institutional connection to the charitable causes closest to his active service. King Charles watched the relentless morning news coverage in his private study with the sound muted, remaining completely still until a bold headline filled a massive screen before slowly turning away. He had reluctantly accepted the decision as an absolute institutional necessity, but the unyielding public debate had transformed a painful family rupture into daily entertainment. Every single argument regarding strength or weakness reduced his 2 sons to flat symbols on a screen, and he deeply felt the heavy human cost of that simplification. William firmly rejected persistent advice from aides to deliver a televised public explanation, insisting instead that the affected charities must speak exclusively about their ongoing work and that the palace machinery must never present the removal as a triumphant political victory. A documented briefing from his private office explicitly recorded this strict instruction: absolutely no celebration, no personal attacks, and no language suggesting that Harry's earlier years of military and charitable service had been worthless. Despite the intense media storm, public opinion remained sharply divided. Fresh polling showed growing, steady support for the foundational principle that royal privileges should exclusively belong to those performing formal, active duties. Yet, genuine sympathy for Harry also steadily rose among military veterans and younger digital audiences who passionately believed his charitable commitment carried intrinsic value far beyond the traditional permission of the palace. The very same decision made the ancient institution look clearer and more disciplined to some, while appearing colder and more rigid to others. Meghan studied the sweeping international coverage closely and understood the deeper, lasting result. The Duchess saw that the removal order had not actually erased their global platform, but rather permanently separated that platform from any remaining trace of royal legitimacy. Harry received a continuous wave of high-profile interview requests from global networks, but he deliberately declined them all. His total silence surprised media commentators and effectively stopped the first furious news cycle from devolving into yet another open, retaliatory attack on his family. Restraint fundamentally changed the trajectory of the story. The palace refused to claim public triumph, and the Sussexes refused immediate retaliation, allowing what began as an ugly scandal to slowly evolve into a broader judgment on the very meaning of royal service itself. When the harsh headlines finally faded and the bitter arguments quieted down across the nation, only one central question remained. Not whether William had possessed the legal power to act, but what his monumental decision had finally settled once and for all. In the end, there was no triumphant winner to celebrate. William successfully secured the absolute authority of the crown, but he accepted profound and likely permanent distance from his only brother. Harry lost the last formal symbols of institutional service, but he gained an independent identity no longer suspended awkwardly between two competing worlds. King Charles successfully preserved the continuity of the institution, while privately grieving what that strict preservation had ultimately cost his family. The revocation order settled the status of the patronages forever, revealing for all to see that the survival of the modern monarchy would now depend upon boundaries far stronger than the ties of blood. William eventually returned to the exact same Windsor table where he had first signed the removal papers, closing the thick patronage file and handing it directly to his private secretary with strict instructions that no celebratory language of any kind should ever enter the official royal archive. A royal archive is a permanent, sacred record where major historical decisions of the monarchy are safely preserved for future generations, and his warning mattered deeply, because he wanted the order to be remembered strictly as an act of solemn constitutional responsibility rather than a personal victory over his brother. The final verdict was completely set in stone. Both contested patronages were permanently and irreversibly reassigned to working members of the royal family. Their charitable programs continued without financial interruption, and the order contained absolutely no path or opening toward future restoration. The future king had successfully established the core principle that inherited status could never replace active, accountable duty, and that even close family proximity would no longer excuse anyone from the rigorous standards required to represent the British crown. Harry accepted this harsh new reality slowly over time, coming to understand that he could continue serving veterans and young people passionately, but he would now do so entirely under his own independent name. William's handwritten personal letter remained safely tucked away among his private possessions. He read its thoughtful contents one final time before returning it to the wooden drawer, choosing not to destroy it or release its contents to the press. That small, quiet decision marked the ultimate turning point. While the brothers had not miraculously reconciled, they officially stopped using the lost patronages as a destructive battlefield for every unresolved emotional wound between them. Outside the family gates, however, the world continued to spin, but the private temperature had finally begun to fall. As the completed order officially entered secure pages of the royal archive, William turned and walked away without looking back across the vast distance. Across the sea, Harry closed the drawer containing his brother's letter, knowing their shared royal chapter had officially closed, yet leaving the final human judgment of each other entirely outside the control of the palace. The patronages were gone, the authority was firmly settled, and the monarchy moved resolutely forward under the leadership of a future king who had chosen clarity over compromise, while two brothers stripped of their last institutional dispute were finally left in peace to decide whether anything human could ever remain between them.
She called as someone who had watched two brothers